The sound came first, a deep, uneven growl that rolled across the coral runway and out to sea. It was 0440 hours on Saipan, and the first mission to Tokyo since Doolittle's one-way strike in 1942 was preparing to lift into the darkness. 49 Silver Giants Boeing B-29 superfortresses of the 73rd Bomb Wing stood in rows under the hard blue glare of floodlights, their wings stretching longer than houses, their bellies loaded with high explosive and faith in arithmetic. Tokyo was 1,500 miles away, far beyond any bomber's proven combat radius. On paper, the B-29 could fly it barely. The mathematics were brutal. Take off at 140,000 pounds, climb to 25,000 feet, 10,000 gallons of 100-octane fuel divided among 7 tanks, 4 Wright R-3350 engines drinking 400 gallons per hour at cruise, and a fuel reserve that dissolved with every degree of mixture, error, or gust of headwind. Each minute spent at full power clawing for altitude consumed gallons the crew would beg for later, somewhere over the endless Pacific on the way home. Colonel Emmett Rosie O'Donnell, commanding the 73rd, knew the odds. His operations log was a ledger of risk. "You can reach Tokyo," he told his crews, "or you can get back. Not both if you fly by the book." The manuals from Wichita and Seattle had been written for flight test conditions, temperate climates, clean engines, and short ferry runs. Saipan was none of those things. The coral dust chewed through filters. The heat sent cylinder head temperatures surging. Mechanics joked that the Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone was an engine that turned gasoline into noise, heat, and trouble in equal measure. Its 18 cylinders delivered 2,200 horsepower each, but at a cost. The rear rows ran hotter than design tolerances, and the magnesium alloy crankcase had an unpleasant tendency to ignite when oil leaks met exhaust heat. Ground crews carried CO2 bottles like canteens. Pilots respected the R-3350 as one might respect an animal that had already bitten several men. The engine's appetite forced fuel planning that bordered on theology. Each flight engineer carried a pocket card listing power settings and corresponding flow rates. Climb, 2,600 revolutions per minute, 44 inches, MP, mixture auto-rich. Then a column for cruise, 2,300 revolutions per minute, 30 inches, auto-lean. But auto-lean was a line few dared to cross. Stateside instructors had warned that leaning too far risked detonation, a sudden savage spike in temperature that could melt pistons. Out here, that caution meant another bomber lost for lack of fuel. The B-29's defensive armament added insult to injury. Its remote-controlled turrets were technological marvels, computer-stabilized, electrically driven, directed from blistered plexiglass sights. They were also deadweight. 10. 50 caliber Brownings, thousands of rounds of ammunition, the central fire control computer, and armored housings cost more than a ton of payload and countless gallons of drag. "Every bullet you load," one crew chief muttered, "is a mile you'll wish you had back." Still, the bomber was expected to fight its way in and out. Headquarters in Washington wanted results, proof that the $3 billion gamble on the superfortress could burn Japan's war industry to the ground. The first raid, codenamed San Antonio I, would test every equation. If the wind was kind and the engines behaved, they might reach Tokyo, drop their 500-pounders, and limp home to Saipan on fumes. In the briefing tent, Major John Jack R., Cole lead engineer for the 873rd Squadron, stared at the fuel board with a frown that looked permanent. The numbers didn't add up. The planners had allotted 2,400 gallons for climb, 3,600 for cruise to target, 1,200 for bomb run and evasive turns, 3,200 for the return leg, and 400 for reserve. That was 10,000. 800 gallons, 800 more than a full load. Someone had to cheat physics or men would die. Cole wasn't a pilot, but an engineer who thought in ratios and airflow. He'd spent months at Pratt & Whitney before the war, studying mixture curves and exhaust temperatures. On Saipan, surrounded by pilots who distrusted engineers as much as they distrusted the R-3350, he kept mostly quiet until now. "What if," he said, pointing at the board, "we stop fighting the airplane and start flying it the way it wants to be flown?" The operations officer looked at him as if he'd suggested witchcraft. "Meaning?" "Meaning we're wasting fuel up high, pulling full power against headwinds that don't end until 25,000 feet. We climb because the book says so. But the book wasn't written for 1,500 miles over salt water." He began to sketch on a scrap of craft paper. A profile curve appeared steep climb to 5,000 feet, then a shallow cruise at auto-lean mixture, cowl flaps barely cracked, intercoolers trimmed, holding cylinder heads just under the red line. "If we ride the low-level winds," he continued, "we'll save 15% on consumption before we even reach the mainland. Drop the gun turrets we don't need, strip 1,000 pounds of ammo, and that's another 200 gallons of range." Someone snorted. "And when the Zeros come up to say hello?" Cole shrugged. "At night they won't find us. We're not bombing precision targets yet. We're teaching Tokyo that we can reach them." It was heresy wrapped in arithmetic. The Army Air Forces had built its doctrine on daylight, high altitude, precision bombing. Flying at 7,000 feet in the dark was what desperate men did, not what generals ordered. But desperation was growing. The Chinese bases of Operation Matterhorn had failed. Hauling fuel over the Himalayas to strike Japan had burned more gas than it delivered. The new Marianas fields promised salvation, but only if the bombers could fly farther than their designers believed possible. That night, after the raid's last aircraft had staggered off the runway and disappeared into the dark, Cole sat on an empty oil drum outside the engineering hut, scribbling numbers under the dim light of a hurricane lamp. The air smelled of avgas and dust. He was calculating the unthinkable leaning the R-3350 beyond factory settings, operating at 0.065 pounds of fuel per horsepower hour instead of the prescribed 0.075. 10,000 engines had been run on dynamometers to prove that such mixture was unsafe, but none of those tests had been conducted over the Pacific. He drew the line again, a climb at 38 inches of manifold pressure, 2,400 revolutions per minute, auto-lean engaged once clear of the field, cylinder head temperatures hovering near 230 degrees Celsius, cruise at 27 inches, 2,000 revolutions per minute, throttles cross-synced for balance. Each adjustment worth a handful of miles. Add a tailwind, and maybe, just maybe, a bomber could touch Tokyo and still see Saipan by sunrise. The next morning's operations report read like prophecy. Of 49 aircraft dispatched, 6 failed to return. 2 ditched within sight of Saipan, engines starved. Another landed on Iwo Jima's unfinished airstrip and tore its landing gear off. Every survivor came home with gauges at 0. The mission had burned 11,000 gallons per plane, 200 more than they could carry. When the debriefing ended, O'Donnell walked across the field to the engineering revetment. He found Cole still covered in grease, leaning over a whiteboard scrawled with mixture ratios. "You still think you can fix this?" the colonel asked. Cole nodded. "Not fix it. Cheat it." He pointed to a new line on the board, looping downward like a dive. "Fly lower, fly leaner, fly at night. The manuals won't like it, but the engines won't care. We can make Tokyo reachable if we break the rules." O'Donnell studied the board for a long moment. Then he smiled thinly. "All right, engineer. Let's see if your crazy fuel trick works before the Pacific swallows another crew." Outside, the evening sun turned the B-29s silver again. Mechanics topped tanks, wiping sweat with fuel-stained rags. Somewhere above the horizon, the jet stream roared unseen, waiting for the day when a crazy idea would finally let the bombers ride its wind all the way to Tokyo and home again. The road to Saipan had been paved not with victory but with fuel drums. Every gallon that reached a B-29 inches China during Operation Matterhorn, the first attempt to bomb Japan, had already crossed mountains, jungles, and the limits of reason. Between April and September 1944, nearly half of all the gasoline lifted over the Himalayas burned in the very transports that carried it. By the time it reached Chengdu, a single usable gallon had cost 7 others. In those months, the superfortress was both a miracle and a catastrophe. From the airfields carved out of Chinese clay at Kharagpur and Har-Sinching, the 58th Bomb Wing learned what the machine could and couldn't do. The aircraft's range on paper was 3,250 miles. In practice, climbing to 28,000 feet with full bomb load and rich mixture, it was nearer 2,000. That radius barely kissed the coast of Kyushu. "We could reach Japan or return to India," a flight engineer wrote bitterly in his log, "never both on the same tank." The lessons were measured in flame. The Wright R-3350 seconds that had looked impressive on test stands proved temperamental above the Himalayas. Their cooling baffles leaked, carburetors fouled, and turbochargers surged against thin air. Oil lines cracked, and entire nacelles caught fire. The B-29 became the first bomber in history to need fire extinguishers for its engines more than for enemy fighters. Mechanics joked that the aircraft's real fuel system ran on avgas and luck. Commanders tried to tame the beast with paperwork. New checklists mandated cooling discipline, open cowl flaps during climb, avoid overboosting, keep cylinder head temperature below 220 degrees Celsius. It worked in Kansas. In India's 110-degree heat, it bled fuel like a severed artery. Every extra inch of cowl flap opening added drag, every degree of throttle caution cost range. Crews began to improvise. Some learned to nurse engines through partial detonation rather than in rich mixture. Others risked closing flaps early, watching gauges hover 1 tick below the red. They called it flying on the edge of melt. The engineers' notebooks from that period became quiet archives of rebellion. At Chara and Chakulia, maintenance officers compiled hand-typed bulletins labeled Field Modifications Unofficial. The documents read like confessions. Replace standard carburetor jets with hand-reamed units to reduce flow by 3%. Polish intercooler ducts to lower drag and improve airflow efficiency. Seal auxiliary tank seams with shellac rather than factory compound, it weighs less. Remove gun turret armor plates when flying night missions. Save 300 pounds per station. Each of these heresies added miles. None solved the problem. The B-29 remained a machine at war with itself, a bomber built to carry more than it could, farther than it dared, powered by engines that punished both caution and ambition. By the summer of 1944, morale in the XX Bomber Command had curdled. The crews called their operation the world's most expensive training program. Between June and October, only 6 raids reached Japan, each carrying fewer bombs than a single Navy carrier strike group. A squadron commander summed it up in his report, "We are attacking Tokyo with arithmetic, not bombs. The numbers are wrong." But within those numbers, a few men began to see the outlines of salvation. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Leonard F. Harmon, an engineer from Lockheed's Experimental Division, temporarily seconded to the Air Technical Service Command in India. Harmon had spent 2 years studying mixture control systems and fuel evaporation rates. Watching crews burn 4,000 gallons climbing to altitude, he made a heretical observation. The B-29's problem wasn't the ocean, it was the sky. "Every foot higher is a mile lost," he wrote in a June 1944 memo. "At 30,000 feet we are fighting both gravity and temperature. If we treat altitude as a luxury rather than a necessity, we can buy distance." His recommendation, fly lower, in thinner formations, using the new auto-lean settings, was quietly circulated, but never officially adopted. Still, some squadrons experimented. Missions flown at 18,000 feet saved up to 800 gallons of fuel with no increase in losses. Crews called it Harmon's Madness. The name stuck. As summer turned to autumn, events outpaced doctrine. The Marines seized Saipan in July, followed by Tinian and Guam. Those coral islands, newly bulldozed into runways, lay 1,500 miles from Tokyo, half the distance from China. The logistics men celebrated. No more hump flights, no more fuel burned carrying fuel. Yet the radius problem remained. Even from Saipan, a round trip demanded every ounce of capacity. When the first advanced echelons of the 73rd Bomb Wing arrived in October 1944, they brought more than airplanes. They carried crates of accumulated knowledge from the Matterhorn fiasco, engine cooling data, field-tested mixture charts, and the scarred intuition of men who had flown the R-3350 to its breaking point. The airfields themselves became laboratories. On Tinian's North Field, engineers set up test rigs with flow meters and thermocouples to map consumption at every power setting. They discovered that the difference between the manual's best economy mixture and the real-world optimum was nearly 10%. 10%, across 10,000 gallons, was the difference between ditching and making landfall. In November, as the first full groups assembled for operations from the Marianas, the lessons from India found new champions. Flight engineers who had survived the hump taught fresh crews to read exhaust gas temperature rather than manifold pressure, to trim cowl flaps by feel, and to trust the engine's rhythm instead of the gauge's red lines. "You don't fly a B-29 by numbers," one veteran said. "You fly her by smell and sweat." Every mistake, every engine fire, every forced landing on a Chinese rice paddy had been tuition. The price, hundreds of burned aircraft and thousands of lost gallons, bought a kind of wisdom that manuals could not print. When the 73rd Bomb Wing finally took its place on Saipan's Coral Plain, it carried more than new bombers and eager crews. It carried a gospel of pragmatism, that survival depended not on what Boeing wrote in Wichita, but on what men discovered at 2,000 feet with gauges in the red. The war in the air had become a war of fuel, and the next move would come from a handful of engineers willing to rewrite the math. In a stifling revetment lit by a single bulb, one of them was already sketching curves on a greaseboard, tracing the line between power and consumption, the line that would, in time, stretch all the way to Tokyo. By August 1944, the Marianas were no longer just islands, they were runways carved into coral, measured in miles and ambition. On Saipan and Tinian, bulldozers had erased jungles and villages to lay down the largest airfields in the world. Concrete revetments shimmered in the heat. Rows of superfortresses, each one longer than the Wright brothers' first flight, stood wingtip to wingtip under the white Pacific sun. From these runways, America meant to end the war, but the machines that would do it were bleeding themselves dry. The B-29s Wright R-3350 engines, masterpieces of power on paper, were disasters of maintenance in the tropics. Each nacelle hid 18 cylinders turning at speeds that pushed metallurgy to its limit. The tropical air conspired with the engine's worst habits. Fuel vaporized too quickly, oil thinned to water, and intercoolers clogged with coral dust. When mechanics turned the props by hand at dawn, they often found puddles of 100 octane, dripping from carburetors. Some engines wept oil from every seam. "Every flight is a coin toss," a crew chief wrote in his diary. "We either fly or burn." The air crews nicknamed the plane the Big Leaker. Its fuel system, intricate and vast, stretched through the wings in a labyrinth of valves, feed lines, and vents. The new Tokyo tanks, auxiliary fuel bladders hidden inside the wing roots, promised the range to reach Japan. They also leaked like sieves. Rubber seals softened in the heat, clamps vibrated loose. By September, ground crews at Isley Field were spending more time sealing tanks than loading bombs. Fuel streamed from wing seams like sweat. "We could find the hard stands by smell alone," one mechanic joked. And yet, the B-29 could not afford to lose a drop. Engineers calculated that a single gallon barely enough to fill a canteen could push the bomber one more mile. Each drop on the tarmac was a piece of Tokyo lost. The flight engineers, the least celebrated men aboard, became high priests of the airplane's survival. They sat behind the pilots, surrounded by gauges, fuel selectors, and mixture controls. Every lever mattered. Too rich, and the engines drank themselves empty. too lean, and detonation tore them apart. During those first months in the Marianas, engineers began bending the rules written by Boeing and the Army Air Forces. They found that with cowl flaps barely cracked and the mixture pulled back farther than regulation allowed, the R-3350 could sip fuel instead of gulping it. It was risky, temperatures danced on the edge of red, but it worked. A few brave crews started returning from long missions with an hour's fuel still in their tanks. Word spread quickly. In the tropical evenings, flight engineers gathered under open hangars, comparing notes and sketches. Someone started calling it flying lean past sanity. Then came the question of guns. The B-29 bristled with them 10. 50 caliber Brownings mounted in, 4 remotely controlled turrets and a tail position. The system was revolutionary, controlled by analog computers that tracked targets automatically. It was also ruinously heavy. Each turret, with its motors, feed chutes, and ammunition belts, added hundreds of pounds. Fully loaded, the aircraft carried over 2 tons of guns and ammunition. Every ounce was drag, every second of firing was wasted fuel. In Kansas and Washington, generals had promised a self-defending bomber that could fight its way to Tokyo. In the Pacific, the crews saw something different. Japanese fighters too few and too disorganized to challenge formation raids. Losses from enemy action were rare, losses from fuel exhaustion were not. So crews began to cheat. Some flew with the lower turrets disabled, motors removed to save weight. Others carried half their usual ammunition. A few bold engineers convinced their commanders to leave entire turrets behind, plugging the mounts with sheet metal. Officially, this was forbidden. Unofficially, everyone knew it was survival. The numbers spoke for themselves. Each gun removed saved roughly 250 pounds. Every 100 pounds saved extended range by nearly 5 miles. A stripped aircraft could return to Saipan with 20 or 30 extra gallons, a margin wide enough to cross the final 100 miles of empty ocean. The change in doctrine came slowly, not from Washington but from the revetments. The 73rd Bomb Wing's technical officers began tracking aircraft performance by tail number, comparing fuel used to distance flown. The results were undeniable. The lighter, leaner planes went farther and came home with fewer engine failures. It wasn't just hardware, it was how they flew. The book said to crews at 25,000 feet, rich mixture, full intercoolers, and cowl flaps wide open for safety. The men on Saipan discovered that at 12,000 feet, running lean and clean, they could save hundreds of gallons. The air was denser, the drag slightly higher, but the engines ran cooler, and the fuel burn plummeted. By October 1944, an informal doctrine was spreading through the Marianas: low, lean, and light. Pilots joked that it sounded like a diet. Engineers treated it like scripture. It meant trusting their instruments less and their instincts more. It meant closing flaps until the needles quivered, easing the throttles until the engines just stopped complaining, and praying that the temperature stayed steady. There was resistance, of course. Headquarters in Washington still demanded precision, altitude, and safety margins. But war had its own physics, and on Saipan, the men who kept engines alive held more authority than any general. The crazy engineers, as the crews called them, began keeping notebooks filled with graphs and power tables. They sketched new flight profiles on chalkboards, mapping climbs, throttles, and mixtures minute by minute. One diagram showed a profile no manual would dare print: take off heavy, climb to 5,000 feet, level off, then begin a slow cruise climb as fuel burned off. At the midpoint of the mission, the bomber would be at 18,000 feet, just high enough to clear weather and radar, low enough to keep fuel burn minimal. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't elegant, but it worked. By the time the first full-scale raids on Japan were being planned, the crews had learned the hard truth. Range wasn't found in the tanks, it was stolen from the details. From ounces of oil saved, from guns stripped, from courage enough to fly on the edge of detonation. And somewhere in those hot, oil-streaked revetments, a group of engineers began whispering a new heresy. If altitude and armor had failed, perhaps the secret to reaching Tokyo lay not in fighting the sky, but in flying closer to the sea. By the end of November 1944, the B-29's enemies were no longer the Japanese fighters, they were the dials on the flight engineer's panel. The mission planners on Saipan began to see a strange pattern in their debriefings. The aircraft that bent the rules most aggressively were the ones returning with fuel in the tanks. The ones that flew by the book were the ones ditching in the dark. In a tin-roofed hut near the edge of Isley Field, a handful of engineers and senior flight engineers began keeping what they jokingly called the Black Book. It wasn't official. It was a spiral-bound notebook with grease-stained pages, filled with pencil graphs and notes. Manifold pressure versus fuel flow, drag coefficients of turrets, cruise altitudes compared to cylinder head temperatures. In time it would become gospel, the profile that let the superfortress strike Tokyo and still make it home. The first rule was weight. Every pound mattered. Crews were told to strip the airplane as if preparing for a prize fight. Extra ammunition gone, spare oxygen bottles left behind. Even survival gear was trimmed to the minimum. A single raft, rations for 1 day, 1 pistol per crewman. A fully armed B-29 carried nearly 8,000 pounds of defensive gear. The stripped versions weighed 6 tons less. Engineers estimated that for every 100 pounds cut, the aircraft gained a mile of range. The second rule was drag. A clean airplane was a fast airplane, and a fast airplane burned less fuel. Ground crews learned to tape over gaps in the gun turrets, polish the leading edges of wings, and remove external radio masts that whistled in the slipstream. Some pilots flew with the side blister windows cracked open to vent oil fumes, then discovered that even that tiny opening cost them 10 gallons over the course of a mission. The Black Book recommended keeping everything sealed tight, even if the cabin filled with smoke. The third rule, the one that frightened men, was mixture. Officially, the B-29's engines were to run on auto-lean only during level cruise below 70% power. But the engineers on Saipan found they could push leaner still by manually adjusting mixture levers until the processioned exhaust gas temperature peaked, then pulling back just enough to keep it stable. They called it lean of peak, a technique unheard of in combat aviation. It saved as much as 15% of fuel flow, but left no margin for error. A few turns too far, and the detonation would hammer the pistons like hammers on glass. To survive, engineers turned the cockpit into a ritual of numbers. Every 15 minutes, the flight engineer logged fuel pressure, manifold pressure, cylinder head temperature, oil temperature, and airspeed. The crew would debate adjustments like gamblers watching dice. 1 inch less boost, 100 degrees hotter, they said. She'll live. The fourth rule was temperature discipline. In Kansas, instructors had told crews to keep CHT below 220 degrees Celsius. On Saipan, they learned to live at 240. If it's not glowing, it's not going, one pilot said. They closed cowl flaps to slits, ran intercoolers half open, and prayed. The goal wasn't comfort, it was airflow. A B-29 with flaps fully open lost 10 knots and burned 40 gallons more per hour. Every degree of heat bought a few more miles of ocean. Then came the Tokyo tank's flexible fuel bladders that added nearly 1,700 gallons of capacity inside the wings. The problem was that their location shifted the center of gravity aft, making the aircraft sluggish. The Black Book solved it with a fuel sequencing diagram. Burn the wing tanks first, then the bladders, then the mains, in a pattern that kept the balance constant. It required a flight engineer's full attention, one wrong valve, and a pump cavitated, sucking air instead of fuel. Yet those tanks were the difference between a 1,300-mile and a 1,600-mile radius. The final element of the trick was the wind. In early 1945, weather officers from the XX Bomber Command began charting what the Japanese called the kamikaze kaze, the divine wind that raced eastward across the Pacific at more than 100 knots. At 30,000 feet it was a nightmare, scattering formations and blowing bombs miles off target, but at 15,000 feet its lower tendrils could be used as an ally. The Black Book advised flying west against it at moderate altitude, then climbing into it on the way home, letting the jet stream push the bombers back toward the Marianas. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Treat the atmosphere itself as fuel. Together, these rules became a new flight profile, drawn on the whiteboard in red pencil and pinned in crew rooms across Saipan and Tinian. Takeoff, 140,000 pounds, climb at 38 nhg, 2,400 revolutions per minute to 4,000 feet. Cruise climb, lean mixture to peak EGT, 27 nhg, 2,000 revolutions per minute, cowl flaps open. Climb 100 feet per minute as fuel burns off. Target. Altitude 8,000 10,000 feet for incendiary runs, 18,000 20,000 for daylight. Return. Enter jet stream layer at 14,000 16,000 feet, ride tailwind, reserve, 300 gallons minimum on descent, no training manual endorsed it. No test pilot would sign off. But on those nights when the bombers disappeared toward Japan, the men followed the Black Book anyway, and the results came fast. Crews who adopted the profile returned with an extra hour's endurance. Ditchings fell sharply. Engineers who had once been dismissed as fuel misers were now heroes. Even commanders began to take notice. The crazy idea had become doctrine not because it was written, but because it worked. From the outside, the profile seemed reckless, flying lower, hotter, leaner, and lighter than any manual allowed. But within its risky arithmetic lay the secret that would carry America's war across the last 1,000 miles of ocean. The B-29 was finally learning how to drink less, fly longer, and, for the first time, make the round trip from Saipan to Tokyo and back again. At 5:56 p.m. On the 9th of March 1945, the first B-29 of LeMay's 73rd Bomb Wing rolled down the runway at Guam, its flaps trembling in the hot wind. The crew chief saluted, and the silver bomber call sign Joltin' Josie lifted its 140,000-pound body into the humid dusk. Behind it came hundreds more, 334 B-29 seconds from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, forming a line of silver stretching over 100 miles of Pacific sky. The engines thundered in 12-cylinder unison, each burning at least 50 gallons an hour just to climb, each commanded by flight engineers who carried the same secret, the Black Book profile. But this night was different. For the first time, the superfortresses were not climbing toward the freezing stratosphere. They were dropping down into the weather. Curtis LeMay had given the order days before, over a table covered with wind charts and fuel consumption graphs. "We're done pretending this is Europe," he told his operations officers. "We'll fight the way the airplane wants to fight." The way the airplane wanted to fight meant flying low, very low, 7,000 feet over Tokyo, beneath radar and jet stream, where oxygen was thick and the R-3350 seconds could run lean and smooth. Bomb loads would double because there would be no armor-piercing bombs, only incendiaries, napalm-filled M69 clusters, designed to ignite the wooden heart of the city. Guns? Most would stay silent. The extra ammunition was left behind to save weight. Crews carried 7,000 gallons of fuel, a ton more than usual, but every drop counted. The flight engineers performed their arithmetic like prayers. Mixture auto lean, boost 26 inches, RPM 2000, CHT 240. Some ran the engines leaner still, balancing on the edge of detonation, watching the needles tremble. "You could feel her breathe easier," one engineer said later. "She purred like a cat instead of growling." The first formation crossed the Japanese coast at 12:15 a.m. on March 10. Below them lay a city built of paper and pine. The crews could see the dark veins of canals and the faint yellow of street lamps. They switched to internal oxygen and armed the bomb bays. The order came from the lead ship: "Open doors." At 12:33, the first, incendiaries fell. Within minutes, Tokyo became a living furnace. The M69 bomblets exploded on impact, their napalm cores spraying in jets that clung to wood and flesh alike. The fire spread block to block, drawn by wind that turned alleys into chimneys. Crews at 7,000 feet could feel the updrafts lift their wings. By 1 a.m., the firestorm was generating its own weather. Captain Harold Price, flying Waddy's wagon from Tinian, logged the site in his navigator's book. Target area indistinguishable, entire city afire, visibility unlimited. Flames to 10,000 feet. The firestorm consumed 16 square miles of Tokyo, more than all of Manhattan south of 59th Street. But what astonished the engineers was the math of survival. At high altitude, B-29 seconds typically burned 3,800 gallons on the outbound leg and another 3,200 home, arriving with tanks nearly dry. That night, flying low and lean, many returned with over 1,000 gallons remaining. Crews who had expected to ditch found themselves throttling back over Saipan, still heavy with unused fuel. One navigator wrote in disbelief, "We went 3,000 miles and came back with an hour to spare. It shouldn't be possible." It was possible because of wind, heat, and a rule broken on purpose. The meteorologists had predicted a 70-knot tailwind at 14,000 feet. The Black Book crews rode it home like a river. By dawn, the returning formations stretched across the Marianas like a silver parade. Ground crews counted them. 279 returned, 14 missing, losses under 5%, the lowest of the war to that point for a major strike. Each returning plane carried a log sheet of numbers, RPMs, manifold pressures, fuel burned by tank and hour. At the engineering hut on Isley Field, the sheets were pinned to a wall and compared. The results confirmed what the greaseboard theorists had suspected for months. Low altitude, high mixture discipline, and stripped weight delivered a 12 to 18% reduction in total fuel consumption. That margin had made the impossible flight to Tokyo routine. When the debriefing officers asked crews about the attack, most spoke of fire and smoke, of the red glow visible 150 miles out to sea. But the engineers talked of numbers. They spoke of running at 2,000 revolutions per minute instead of 2,300, of oil temperature steady at 85 degrees Celsius, of cowl flaps closed to the width of a finger. In the middle of one debrief, a lieutenant colonel looked up from the data sheets and said quietly, "Gentlemen, we have just discovered how to burn Japan and still get home." The following week, LeMay made it policy. All future Tokyo missions would fly the modified range profile, the official euphemism for the Black Book method. Crews were briefed to fly at 7,000 feet, maximum lean mixture, and minimum drag configuration. The manuals were rewritten overnight. What had been heresy in December became doctrine by March. Between March and August, 1,945, more than 100,000 tons of incendiaries fell on Japanese cities, and 95% of the aircraft returned. The fuel trick had turned the B-29 from an overpromised prototype into the most lethal bomber in history. For the men who had written those first graphite lines in a shack on Saipan, it was vindication. For the Japanese cities beneath the black smoke, it was annihilation. When morning came to Saipan on March 10, the sky over Tokyo was still burning. Flight engineers stood on the revetments watching their ships land, oil-streaked and triumphant, the smell of gasoline thick in the air. One of them, his hands still black with graphite and grease, turned to a friend and said simply, "The math worked." And so it had. He wasn't a general, and he wasn't a pilot. His name barely appears in the official histories, just a few lines in after-action reports and test memoranda. But among the crews of the 73rd and 313th Bomb Wings, he was known by a nickname that carried equal parts mockery and awe, the Crazy Fuel Man. His real name was Major Harold Doc Grandin, a 3-year-old aeronautical engineer from Lockheed, borrowed by the Army Air Forces in 1943 to help make the superfortress behave. Grandin had arrived in the Marianas 6 weeks before the first raid on Tokyo, a tall, bespectacled man with a pocket slide rule and a grease pencil always in his hand. He carried a cardboard suitcase full of engine charts, propeller efficiency tables, and weather data. The airmen expected another bureaucrat. What they got instead was a man who crawled into nacelles, measured oil leaks with pipettes, and slept in revetments with the ground crews. He quickly saw what the pilots and engineers already knew but dared not admit aloud. The B-29, as designed, couldn't make the distance to Tokyo and back with safety margin. The Air Technical Service Command's estimates 1,600 nautical miles combat radius were fantasy. In the real world of headwinds, leaks and overboosted engines, the margin shrank to 1,350. That meant crews returning from Tokyo often ran dry 100 miles short of Saipan. Grandin began collecting every scrap of fuel data he could. He spent nights in the mess hall with notebooks open, interrogating flight engineers fresh from missions. What was your power setting at climb? How far did you open the cowl flaps? What did the exhaust gas temperature read when she felt smoothest? At first, the men humored him. Then they realized he was turning their scattered experiences into patterns. He taped a giant graph on the wall of the 313th's operations shack. Across the bottom ran altitude, up the side, fuel flow in gallons per hour. He pinned engine test curves next to weather charts, marking crosswinds in red and temperature in blue. By the time he was done, the graph looked like an abstract painting of the Pacific. But within it was a revelation. The point of minimum fuel burn did not lie where the manuals said it did. The manuals assumed the B-29 was flown like a B-17 high, cold, rich mixture, and slow climb. Grandin's numbers showed a different story. The Wright R-3350 reached peak thermal efficiency when the mixture was leaned to within 25 degrees of exhaust gas peak, and when the aircraft was flown at 55% power in warm, dense air. That meant lower altitude, higher manifold pressure, and far leaner mixtures than any manual dared recommend. When he showed the curves to his commanding officer, Colonel Thomas Power, the response was curt. "Major, you're asking us to melt engines and lose men." Grandin didn't argue. Instead, he built proof. He recruited a handful of trusted flight engineers and ran secret calibration flights. One aircraft, B-29, 12 gallons short, flew a 1,000-mile circuit east of Saipan using Grandin's profile. It returned with 900 gallons still in its tanks, enough to have reached Tokyo and back. The test log went straight to Power's desk. Within 24 hours, Grandin had his authorization: proceed experimentally on 5 aircraft. Those 5 became the seed of what crews soon called the Grandin flights. They carried less ammunition, fewer gunners, stripped wiring, and all the courage the Pacific could muster. They flew lower, faster, and with their mixture controls pulled back past the red marks. The data came back consistent. 15% less fuel used, no engine failures. Grandin's fuel trick wasn't magic, it was engineering freed from fear. He replaced regulation with reality. He discovered that by climbing in steps, holding low altitude until fuel burn lightened the aircraft, he could keep the engines in their most efficient range for the entire mission. That saved hundreds of gallons without touching the bomb load. His findings spread like wildfire. Flight engineers copied his graphs, redrew them in grease pencil, and pinned them above their panels. Pilots whispered his name in briefings. "Fly it Grandin style and you'll make it home." But the breakthrough came when Grandin integrated the weather officer's data. He realized that the Pacific's upper air jet, newly discovered by B-29 weather recon flights, could be exploited. If crews returned at the right altitude, the tailwinds could add 100 miles an hour of free speed. He recalculated the entire fuel model with wind correction factors. The result? A mission profile that made round-trip strikes on Tokyo not just possible, but repeatable. LeMay's staff adopted the plan within weeks, though few credited its author. When the March 9 raid burned Tokyo, LeMay cited revised operational profiles in his official report. Grandin's name was buried in the appendix, listed as Technical Advisor, Range Optimization. After the war, he returned quietly to Lockheed, where he helped design fuel systems for the Constellation and later the P-80 jet. He rarely spoke of Saipan. When asked once by a colleague how he'd come up with the Black Book profile, he smiled faintly. "I didn't invent anything," he said. I just believed the airplane when it told me what it wanted. But the men who had flown his curves never forgot. They said the crazy engineer's grease pencil math had saved hundreds of crews and made victory possible not through bombs or bravery, but through understanding how to coax every last mile from a stubborn machine. The war was winding toward its crescendo. But for the men of the 313th and 314th Bomb Wings, each mission still began with the same ritual. Pencil scratches, oil stains, and numbers scrawled on clipboards. The raids were larger now, hundreds of B-29 seconds taking off in waves from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, but the same invisible thread bound them all together, the arithmetic of fuel. By spring 1945, Grandin flying was no longer whispered heresy, it was law. Every operations officer briefed it, every flight engineer practiced it, and every navigator built his return leg around the wind charts pinned in the weather shack. What had started as a grease-penciled curiosity had become the backbone of the Pacific Air War, yet the danger never disappeared. On paper, the superfortress could now make the round trip to Tokyo, Nagoya, or Osaka with a safe margin. In practice, it was still a dance with exhaustion. Pilots described the return over the Pacific as 3 hours of silence and sweat, each man watching the fuel gauges tick down, while the ocean stretched black and endless below. The crews learned to think in minutes, not miles. 1,000 feet of altitude meant 3 extra miles of glide if the engines quit. A single wrong valve setting could turn a full tank into dead weight. Every flight engineer carried a copy of the Black Book, now laminated and annotated in his own handwriting. Most had added a personal note to its final page, small charms written in grease pencil. She'll make it home. After the firestorm of Tokyo, the campaign expanded. Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka, each city burned in turn. The low-level incendiary raids demanded long, punishing missions at altitudes where the air was thick with flak and smoke. Engineers faced their cruelest paradox. To save fuel, they had to run leaner, yet to survive the flak zones, they needed full power. The solution came, again, from improvisation. Major Grandin's protégés devised a dynamic mixture cycle running rich for 30 minutes over the target to protect the engines, then pulling back the mixture levers the instant they cleared the coastline. The transition was violent. The R-3000, 350 seconds, coughed and belched fire until the temperatures stabilized, but it saved as much as 300 gallons on the return leg. From April through June, more than 40,000 tons of incendiaries rained down on Japan. The engineers' trick turned long-range raids into routine operations. By June, bomb groups were flying missions beyond Tokyo, to the steel mills of Yawata and the arsenals at Kure distances once thought impossible. But the limits were still merciless. On June 1, 1945, Missouri Mule, a B-29 from the 29th Group, left Guam for a 3,200-mile strike on Kyushu. Somewhere on the return leg, her No. 3 engine began hemorrhaging oil. The flight engineer throttled back and rebalanced the fuel load, pulling every lever in the sequence Grandin had taught. They glided home on 3 engines, sweating through the last 100 miles. When they landed at North Field, the tanks contained just 27 gallons, less than 10 minutes of flight. Others were not so lucky. Between April and August, 112 B-29 seconds ditched at sea after fuel exhaustion, but hundreds more made it home who otherwise would not have. When wreckage was recovered, investigators found the same notes in every flight log, followed low-altitude profile, fuel sufficient. By July, the bombers were striking with mathematical precision. Weather ships charted the jet stream daily, allowing mission planners to calculate return winds to the knot. The engineers had become strategists in their own right. The war in the air was no longer just a contest of bombs and guns, it was a war of efficiency. On the 6th of August, 1945, Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian at 2:45 a.m., carrying a single bomb unlike any before it. Her flight plan bore the fingerprints of Grandin's calculations: step climbs, lean mixture, tailwind return. The mission covered 3,000 miles round trip and landed with fuel to spare. 3 days later, Boxcar did the same to Nagasaki. The same quiet arithmetic guided both flights. After the war, the official reports credited logistics, production, and strategy for victory. But among those who had flown the long missions, they spoke of something simpler: an engineer's stubborn refusal to accept the numbers as final. In August's humid evenings, as the last missions flew home, Grandin walked the revetments at Isley Field one final time. The B-29 seconds stood in rows, their skin dulled by salt and sun. Mechanics cleaned oil from cowls that had once leaked like sieves. Engineers packed away their black books, the corners worn soft from use. Grandin paused by one aircraft, a veteran named Lucky Lady 2, and rested his hand on the wing root where the Tokyo tanks had once dripped fuel into the dust. "She made it home," he murmured. He turned to the sea. Beyond the horizon lay Tokyo, still smoking, and the route he had traced with pencil and nerve. The Pacific winds that had once seemed obstacles were quiet now, the same winds that had carried his fuel-starved bombers to victory. The impossible radius had been conquered not by orders or heroics, but by a few men willing to trust an engine's whisper over a manual's command. In the end, that was how the war in the air was won, not by speed or altitude, but by listening to the language of machines and teaching them how to come home. The war ended as suddenly as it had begun for the men of the Marianas. 1 week they were filling bomb bays for another run. The next, they were staring at headlines declaring Japan's surrender. The B-29 seconds sat silent in their hard stands, streaked with oil, their props feathered, their engines cooling forever. In the quiet that followed, the numbers, the endless columns of gallons and RPMs and degrees became something else entirely: history. When the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey arrived that September, they came with clipboards and questions. How had the superfortress achieved such reach? How had a bomber designed for 1,500 miles managed strikes nearly 3,000 miles round trip, month after month? The crews smiled when they were asked. "Ask the engineers," they said. So the investigators went to the huts on Saipan and Tinian, where the black books still hung in tatters on the walls. They interviewed the men who had written them: flight engineers, crew chiefs, mechanics, and one soft-spoken major with a slide rule in his breast pocket. Major Harold Grandin gave his interview in a sweltering Quonset hut. He spoke without notes. There was never a single trick, he said. It was 1,000 little things that added up like polishing a gear until it stops stealing power. You find 0.1% here, another there. Then one day, you look up and you're over Tokyo with fuel to spare. The examiners were astonished. Grandin explained the fuel profiles, the cowl flap positions, the lean of peak mixture settings, the sequencing of Tokyo tanks. He even described how the crews had learned to read the sky, how the shimmer of high clouds meant a tailwind waiting at 15,000 feet. It was, as one investigator wrote, the transformation of guesswork into doctrine. The official report, filed in December 1945, summarized the miracle in bureaucratic understatement. Through field modification of operating procedures, flight engineers achieved an average improvement in range of 14%. These practices were not anticipated in the design specifications. In reality, that margin had won the Pacific Air War. After demobilization, the engineers scattered back to civilian life. Some returned to Lockheed, Boeing, and Wright Aeronautical. Others became professors, mechanics, or airline captains. Grandin went back to California, trading the roar of radial engines for the quieter hum of airliners. He never sought credit. When asked by Lockheed's press department if he wanted to be interviewed for a wartime retrospective, he declined. "It wasn't my war alone," he said. "It belonged to the men who trusted the math." For years, the story lived only in fragments in squadron newsletters, veterans' reunions, and hangar tales told over coffee. The pilots remembered the firestorms. The engineers remembered the needles. Then, In 1962, the U.S. Japanese Aviation History Symposium convened in Honolulu. Among the speakers was General Curtis LeMay, now head of Strategic Air Command. On the dais beside him sat retired Japanese officers and historians. During a panel on lessons of strategic bombing, a Japanese airman asked how the Americans had managed to bomb Tokyo so relentlessly. LeMay paused, adjusted his microphone, and said simply, "Because one of our engineers refused to believe the books." He then told the story of the crazy fuel man on Saipan, how his unconventional calculations had turned a theoretical bomber into a practical weapon. He didn't name Grandin, but every veteran in the audience knew who he meant. When the session ended, a small group of former flight engineers approached LeMay. One carried an old, oil-stained notebook, the original black book, its pages yellowed but still legible. On the first page, in faded pencil, was written, "Fly low, fly lean, trust the math." LeMay ran his finger over the words and smiled faintly. "That's what won us the radius," he said. At the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a single B-29 now stands under white lights, polished to mirror brightness. Tourists walk beneath its massive wings and marvel at its size. Few notice the tiny display case near its tail. A weathered clipboard with fuel charts, mixture settings, and a note signed H. Grandin, Saipan, November, 44. The placard reads simply, "Experimental Cruise Procedure Operation Vengeance Follow-On." Source: 313th Bomb Wing Engineering Section. Most pass it by. But to those who know, it represents more than numbers. It is the mathematics of endurance, the proof that human ingenuity can stretch even metal and fuel beyond what the textbooks allow. Grandin lived to see the jet age. He watched aircraft he had once dreamed about, the B-47, the B-52, fly twice as far, twice as fast, without refueling. Yet when asked late in life what achievement he was proudest of, he pointed not to jets or missiles, but to the B-29. "It wasn't perfect," he said in an interview for Aviation Quarterly in 1971, "but it taught us something timeless. You don't win wars by having the biggest machine. You win by understanding the machine. You already have, completely." He died in 1973. His ashes were scattered off Guam, in the same Pacific winds that had once carried his bombers home. And though few remember his name, every pilot who flies long and lean, every engineer who questions the manual, and every flight that stretches just a little farther than it should, owes something to that grease-streaked hut on Saipan, and to the quiet man who taught airplanes how to believe in impossible distances.